Hello and a very warm welcome. 2 years as US President, and for the world outside his country's borders, the question about Donald Trump should perhaps be, what next? Who now is in the crosshairs? Very good to have your company. You're watching Roundtable with me, David Foster. Is there any kind of foreign policy strategy that can be identified as, well, real strategy? Our experts will examine how the world, according to Trump, has changed and where we all might be heading.
Every week, the world waits for President Donald Trump's next 280-character outburst. Some of his tweets have caused his administration legal problems. Others have resulted in full-blown diplomatic incidents. His plans to withdraw US troops from Syria took everyone by surprise, including his own team. The president's way of doing things marks a drastic change in diplomacy and leadership. He's been willing to reach out to America's old rival Russia and brokered a historic meeting with North Korea's leader. But for some, the commander-in-chief has destabilized the traditionally led American world order, while others call his honesty refreshing. Has his America First foreign policy been successful or caused profound diplomatic damage?
So let's get talking. Joining us from Ohio in the United States, Tom Sutton, Dr. Tom Sutton, Professor of Political Science at Baldwin Wallace University. From Durham in the United Kingdom, Dr. Tom Packer, Politics Department at that city's university. And with me in the studio, Greg Swenson, Republicans overseas, and Professor Clive Webb, Professor of Modern American History at the University of Sussex. Tom Sutton, I'm always going to have to use both your names because there are two Toms in the programme, but Tom Sutton, first of all, as somebody from the United States, in the United States, would you agree with this assessment that Donald Trump has changed the course of diplomacy?
Yes, absolutely. What President Trump has done basically is to take the concept of national interest and really accelerate it in basically putting America first in terms of beyond diplomatic relations, putting the first priority on American commitments when it comes to diplomatic issues. And basically we're seeing a profound change when it comes to our arrangements, our alliances, our agreements with European allies, with Japan, with Korea, and in some ways a dramatic shift towards those that we saw as adversaries before. The relations with Russia, also sanctions have been a part of that situation. North Korea trying to denuclearize North Korea through direct summit talks without the aid of a lot of his assistance. And really, in many ways, bringing back what some would say was a neo-isolationist kind of approach to American foreign policy, but again, keeping with his interpretation of what constitutes America's national interest.
Okay, Tom Packer. We talked about diplomacy there. I mean, there are obviously different types of ways of dealing with people, but has his undiplomatic diplomacy worked in any way?
I would say his style is very distinctive, but the degree to which his policies is distinctive can be grossly exaggerated, not least because he's not a foreign policy specialist, has no foreign policy background. So the huge degree, the policies have continued almost an autopilot, either as generic Republican foreign policy or even as generic American foreign policy. And I think sometimes his style can be refreshing and new, but he also can be extremely inconsistent, which just leads to confusion in foreign policy.
Clive, you don't have to be an expert in foreign policy to be an American president. You can go back through Ronald Reagan, Jimmy Carter. I mean, Richard Nixon was, of course, but I mean, if you pick, say, let's 5 of the last 10 US presidents, not necessarily foreign policy experts. He didn't have to be, but he's very different. Is that bad?
Not in theory, I don't think, and you're absolutely right. I mean, politicians are elected on for a number of reasons. One of those will be domestic politics rather than foreign affairs. So in that sense, his lack of formal experience in foreign affairs is not necessarily a negative. I think where we're seeing that inexperience sometimes showing has been in the way that he has stripped back the US State Department has relied upon an inner circle of advisors in order to conduct foreign policy, rather than necessarily going through conventional channels. And sometimes there's been a negative consequence arising from that.
Would you think that America is weaker now than it was internationally before he came to power, or has his strange brand, if you like, made America perhaps slightly stronger internationally?
I think it depends on what audience you're talking about here. I think it plays very well to his base back in the United States, who see him taking a very strong hand in dealings not only with traditional adversaries, but also traditional allies, and seeing his get-tough approach, for example, on NATO and his determination to ensure that the members of NATO pay their fair share to maintain that organization. At the same time, of course, it looks weak to other countries because he has at times created a vacuum that is now being filled by other international leaders.
Okay, Greg, you've had to do an awful lot of defending of Donald Trump, not his politics anyway, if
Sure.
not his character. How would you define the last 2 years in terms of foreign policy, the way America views the world and is viewed by the world?
Yeah, look, I think Clive brought up a good point. You know, he wasn't elected necessarily because of foreign policy experience, nor were a lot of the more recent presidents. You have an exception.
You can take into account Ford, you can take into account Bush too.
Absolutely, and Obama as well.
Obama,
And really only
Senator.
H.W. was one that had
Yeah.
really outrageous or exceptional foreign policy experience, because it doesn't really rank that high in the Americans, you know, sort of list of priorities. So, you know, the average voter just doesn't care. Now, once in a while it heats up, you know, during the Cold War, there were probably moments where foreign policy was an issue. But look, I think in general, domestic policy is much more important during a campaign, and Trump showed that, and his opponent, you know, had much more international experience than he did, and yet, you know, he was able to win. So I think it's been surprisingly good from a conservative perspective. Nobody really knew what he was all about in terms of foreign policy. You know, he did a lot of this, you know, campaigning where he was saying America first, and that was just campaign slogans. We really didn't know what to expect.
But he has been isolationist.
Well, to a certain degree, but he's done a few things that have probably made the world a better place. I think calling out NATO on not spending enough money is probably going to improve the spending, we hope. You know, he's called out little things.
Dumping the Iran nuclear deal?
No, you know, I think that was wise in retrospect, because it wasn't a treaty. It was never brought to the Congress like treaties should be. So it was really just another Obama executive order kind of thing where
it wasn't just Obama, though. I mean,
right,
there were other countries involved in this.
Absolutely,
as well.
and I think if you look at John Kerry, it was kind of his effort at having a legacy and doing something big. But I don't think that they did it through the right process, and I think that was a mistake. But look, I think generally speaking, conservatives are pleasantly surprised with what happened, because we didn't know what to expect. And people talk about Trump being disruptive and bringing a new style. Look, his disruption often is just personality based.
Yeah.
He's rude, he's petty, he's erratic. Those things are troubling, but he does bring, you know, some disruption to the process, and I think it worked. He called out the Germans on Nord Stream 2. He's got, you know,
that's the pipeline.
Right,
yeah.
right, and he's been, in spite of his friendly rhetoric with Putin, he's actually been pretty tough on Russia. He, in spite of the schoolyard brawl he had with Kim Jong-un, I'm sure we'll get to this, he's got Kim Jong-un to the table. So in spite of the uncertainty, and it makes people nervous, and it makes conservatives nervous as well, it's been a pleasant surprise.
Okay, Tom Sutton, a couple of notes I made before the program were that Trump thought these two items were unfair. Let's just tackle the first one. The second one is trade deficits, and the first one is security alliances. That he believed that the United States had for too long been the policeman of the world, and was paying for it in huge financial terms. Has he changed that?
Well, I think he's changed it at the margins. Certainly his rhetoric has been very strong, and as was indicated, he ran on this kind of platform to hold others accountable for their costs. We are in that post-Cold War world. In some ways, he ignored the contributions of NATO to the Afghanistan conflict, the Iraq conflict. But this whole concept of accountability is something that resonates strongly with American voters. I think he has seen an increase in contributions of NATO. At the same time, I think what's surprising is that on the commercial side, we're seeing him back things that really are directly in the interests of the United States, particularly in his relations with the European Union, and to a degree his relations with some of our Asian allies and trading partners such as Japan, South Korea, and of course his pulling out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership being an example of that.
Tom Packer, let me put this to you, and please feel free, any of you, at any one time, to add to or contradict or tell me I'm wasting my time asking the questions because you know more than I do, which is certainly a fact. But when it comes to putting together his foreign policy, he has had countless, well, not countless, but I mean, he's had quite a few secretaries of state, quite a few secretaries of defense, national security advisors, and the suggestion is that now, with John Bolton et al., former UN ambassador for the United States, very hawkish. He has now got a team that will lead him in the right direction.
Well, I think it depends a bit what policy you desire. I think John Bolton in many ways speaks to Trump's instincts in terms of not being held down excessively by the multilateral world order. And I think some of the innovations, which aren't necessarily Bolton's, such as Jerusalem embassy, were widely predicted in the foreign policy community to be a disaster and simply haven't been. Where I think Donald Trump and John Bolton's instincts differ a great deal is partly on Russia, but even more on the use of force. So it's one thing to not want to be tied down by international agreements. It's another thing to start conflicts. And John Bolton has always been a big believer in a very assertive exercise for American force. I'd say much more than President Trump. So I wouldn't necessarily assume John Bolton's going to be making all the policies. And the fact there's been moves towards pulling out of Syria, which John Bolton, I'm sure, is against, suggests it's not a simple matter that John Bolton is deciding policy at the moment. It's still it is, as it's been throughout this administration, very fluctuating. Congressional Republicans have a big say. World leaders, President Trump has a close personal relationship with, have a big say. Who is currently favored. It's very much like a medieval court, but in some ways unfair to medieval court. So even if, as to some degree I do, you have a lot of time for Donald Trump's foreign policy instincts, I would be very worried about the lack of process and clear principles there.
So you don't think John Bolton's going to actually sort of make Trump, if you like, slightly less awry? He's not going to keep him on the straight and narrow?
Well, if there are differences in terms of consistency, it'll be at the margins. And there's been a long history of people come in, Donald Trump's very excited by them, there's huge deference to them to start with, and then they get less and less influence as time went on. That happened to General Mattis, the outgoing Secretary of Defense. That happened to Secretary of State Tillerson. There's a huge tendency, that happened to Chief of Staff Kelly. There's a huge tendency that when they come in, they have huge power. Where there are consistency are in congressional Republicans, because they're super important for President Trump, and also for his own immediate family. So Mr. Kushner, his son-in-law, who no one's mentioned, is likely, touch wood, to stay a significant force, touch wood from Mr. Kushner's point of view.
OK, well, we'll get on to that, I think, if we discuss the Middle East in some sort of detail. But the friends he has made, I mean, Tom Packer mentioned those. Has he made some unwise choices, Clive?
I think so. I think his admiration for autocratic leaders around the world is profoundly problematic. Rodrigo Duterte in the Philippines being an example of that. I think that he gives license to those dictatorial leaders to behave in an increasingly aggressive, nationalistic way. I mean, you know, he stands almost alone in his admiration for Duterte. He said, you know, there's obviously Putin in Russia, there's Kim Jong-un in North Korea, and perhaps the latter is a more problematic case, if one goes into the detail of that. But all the same, I think, the fact that he speaks so positively about them on the one hand, but also the fact that he's rolling back on other issues such as human rights at the same time means that he is creating greater opportunity for more autocratic leaders around the globe to be able to push an anti-democratic line.
There is a tendency here to assume that he is going to be different when he comes into office because he's an elected politician. But in fact, what you're just outlining there is the way that he behaved as a businessman. I mean, not going out and shooting drug dealers like Duterte does, but in saying, this is what I want, this is how it's going to happen, and if you don't like it, you can walk, which is what's happened to a number of people within his administration. That's dangerous in a leader, isn't it? If you talk about autocratic regimes, despotic regimes, in a sense, if you weren't held back by certain constraints.
I'm sure some of the others will take issue with the word dangerous. At the very least, it's different, and I would say at times it is dangerous. I mean, the fundamental difference between Trump and his predecessors is that he has, at times, promoted an almost values-free foreign policy. I mean, he defined foreign policy, certainly as a candidate and to some extent as president, in terms of economics. Rather than, so it's been about the promotion of America's economic interests, pushing back against what he perceives as unfair trading practices by countries like China, rather than America playing the role of global policeman that it has done since the end of the Second World War, and in particular the promotion of human rights. I mean, Trump has been very explicit about this, that he does not see the US's role as being to intervene in other nations, but as he sees it, to set a shining example to others. I mean, that in itself
We've generalised now, let's be a bit more specific.
Can I interject slightly on what you just said? I was going to say, I think it's worth remembering President Obama was a big shift to a less moralistic foreign policy than George Bush, particularly early George Bush. There's been quite a move against making democracy and human rights central for a while. And also, one striking feature of President Trump, wherever his occasional autocratic flourishes, are how much he lets very senior members of the administration pursue a different foreign policy than he says. Arguably, what's striking
that's until he sacks them, isn't it?
Obviously, he has a tendency to sack them, but very often not when they've particularly been taking a line in foreign policy. What's unusual with President Trump is how much discretion he gives to senior members of his administration to pursue a different policy. You wouldn't last 10 minutes under Barack Obama or George W. Bush if you'd done the kind of thing General Mattis did.
I mean, I suppose there is what you could also add to that is that he's not paying much attention, that he is like Ronald Reagan. He was being briefed by Jim Baker saying, I'm sorry, I didn't read your notes because Mary Poppins was all The Sound of Music was on.
I think much more so than Ronald Reagan. much more so.
Dangerous friends.
Well, you know, look, I think we were all disappointed from a conservative perspective that he was a little too friendly with Kim Jong-un and he's a little too friendly with Putin. So that was a disappointment that he reached out. Remember, his relationship with Kim Jong-un started very negative. You know, he had this schoolyard brawl, calling each other names. So, you know, people tend to forget that. But generally speaking, we didn't really like the fact that he...
The mother of all bombs.
Yeah, exactly. And, you know, Rocket Man, all that ridiculousness. But it ended up, in a way, it worked because he got him to the table. There's been a lot of, you know, productive interaction between him and these leaders. But absolutely, I agree that his chumminess or his embrace of these guys, the bad guys, the bad actors, is a little troubling. But the fact that he has them at the table, the fact that he's made progress, is probably a good thing. Now, what was great about Reagan is he always injected human rights into the argument. You know, all the way back. You know, with all of his dealings with Gorbachev, he always brought that into the picture. And he quoted you know Solzhenitsyn. I mean, he really never forgot about the common man. And now you don't see that, right?
And that's bad.
But remember, it's a different style. And
no, but is it troubling? Is it worrying for the rest of us?
Look, I think there should always be a focus on human rights. I'm with the Henry Jackson Society on this. Democracy, freedom, and human rights. It should be a very big part of it. The only time we've really seen him talk about that is with the problem at the border, but that's a whole different topic. But no, look, I think it is troubling, and I would like to see more of that. But we knew this in the campaign, that his style was to say, okay, America first, let's not be the policeman. I find it interesting, too, that some of his greatest critics would be the same ones who criticized any sort of, you know, action by the U.S. around the world. I thought the left would embrace the fact that Trump wanted to pull out of Syria. I thought it was a mistake tactically, but, you know, that would usually be something that the left would celebrate, and they haven't.
Can I ask Tom Sutton a couple of things? When it comes to his relationship with Putin, and obviously by extension Russia, how different is the United States-Russia deal right now compared to before Trump came in?
I think it's dramatically different in the way that we've seen Trump develop his relations with Putin. And what overhangs all of the relations with Putin are what are happening with the investigations into Russian interference with the 2016 elections. And by extension, is there evidence that the Trump campaign was involved with any of that? And number two, the more recent evidence that's starting to come out about the possibility that he's been influenced by Putin or by his relations with Russian officials vis-a-vis deals to develop Trump Tower in Russia during and after the Trump campaign.
Okay, what about with China? With
Right.
China, where does the US stand now?
Well, I think China, I would give him credit for in what he's trying to accomplish. He is taking on what others have not, which is to directly challenge China on the issue of intellectual property rights, on protecting American companies that are trying to do business in China. But in doing so, using trade tariffs really as a hammer, has gotten their attention, but it's also had unintended consequences, particularly for American manufacturing and farmers.
Okay, Tom Packer, where would you like to go in terms of the way there's been a major shift between two specific areas of influence or two specific countries, the US and?
I'd say, and Israel's been an interesting one. I largely agree on what the previous speaker said on China. It's been striking how there's been recognition of the US embassy in Jerusalem. There's been a cancellation of the Iran deal. And whether you're for or against it, there was widespread predictions this would lead to immediate disaster. And it simply hasn't. And I think to some degree that will shift the long term. Now, another Republican president would have cancelled the Iran deal. I doubt they'd have moved the embassy. And I think most of the Republicans elected wouldn't have cancelled the Iran deal. So that's a genuine shift in a more pro-Israeli foreign policy direction, which I think will at least somewhat stick.
And Clive here, where would you like to highlight?
I'd highlight this country. I mean, the supposed special relationship between the United States and Britain. I mean, we've been, principal allies of one another as countries since the Second World War. That relationship has never looked more precarious than it does now. I mean, Theresa May was, of course, the first foreign leader to go to Washington, D.C. to visit Trump after his election and inauguration. And she was very quickly wrong-footed thereafter by his announcement of the ban on predominantly Muslim nations, about which she knew nothing and which she was effectively ambushed at a press conference when she was in Turkey. And since then, he has used Twitter and other channels to criticize her very extensively.
But did that special relationship exist in anything but name before this?
I think it does at an institutional level. Certainly the intelligence sharing between Britain and the United States. That's still there. Yeah. And so in that sense, that does suggest to us about the limitations of focusing solely on the personality of the president as opposed to thinking about the larger institutions of state and how those continue to operate.
So to some extent, he has only vocalized what was the reality, and beneath the surface, it is still much the same as it was. So nothing really has changed.
I mean, I think things could change fundamentally depending on the outcome of the current Brexit process. Yeah. So obviously...
And he will be opportunistic in that.
Well, Trump's fundamental approach to foreign policy is a transactional one. So he's looking to see in what way he can further America's interests. And
what's
if Britain,
in it for me?
Yeah, and if Britain can no longer serve the strategic function that it once did, for instance, as a bridgehead to Europe, then that may be an issue. Although, of course, his relationship with Europe is itself very, very problematic.
No permanent friends, no permanent enemies. I rather like that. I didn't write it, but somebody did. And I read it.
Clive mentioned transactional, and that's just the way he is. His support in the U.S. politically has been completely transactional. You've had conservatives on the right who are very uncomfortable with his personal behavior, his tendency to send tweets out or whatever he does, and his erratic behavior. And yet, if it's good for some policy that they support, then they're okay with it, and they look the other way. So transactional, I think, is a key word to look at this. No, I don't think Trump will have any great friends at the end of his administration, whether it's 4 or 8 years. There's a lot of people who won't work with him or for him because they think it might be a career ender, and and there's some that's troublesome that he can't bring. He can't expand his base at all.
We don't have very much
time. In or out of
So
Washington.
Tom Packer, just a quick one from you, if you would, because you're nodding your head.
Yes, I was just agreeing that the degree to which he's regarded as untrustworthy has been a huge problem for his foreign policy, because it means so many Republican experts won't go and work there. So it's just a serious shortage of a foreign policy team. So a lot, I think, is seen as conspiracy, is, I think, just lack of proper administration. So I think, for example, things like Brexit, his administration, his ambassador, his national security advisor are quite sympathetic, but they lack the wherewithal in terms of sheer bureaucratic resources to develop a new dynamic.
Okay, very quickly, I want to just go to Tom Sutton just for the final word on this, since you're in the United States. No better, no worse than you feared in terms of America's position in the world, or what?
I think the Americans' position in the short term is unpredictable, and that unpredictability creates a precarious situation. The concept of policy is largely lacking in everything the Trump administration has done, other than economic interests first. And I think that paves the way for our loss of leadership in the world, either on human rights or in alliances.
I thank you all very, very much indeed. Just one other point I didn't manage to get in, but if you're talking about the trustworthiness of Donald Trump, and we do have to end the program at this point, Washington Post reporting that there have been 7,000 presidential falsehoods issued in the last 2 years. By my estimation, it's not quite 10 a day, but it's very close to it. Thank you for speaking the truth as you see it, each and every one of you. Thank you for watching. From me, David Foster, goodbye for now. We hope to have your company next time.